Before Schopenhauer introduces suffering, desire, or the will, he stands on the shoulders of a philosophical earthquake. That earthquake was Immanuel Kant. For centuries, philosophers argued about what the world is like. Kant changed the question. He asked, how is experience even possible? His answer quietly destabilized everything. We do not encounter reality as it exists independently. We encounter reality as it appears to us. Kant draws a distinction that becomes foundational. Phenomenon, the world as it appears to us. Noumenon, the thing in itself, reality independent of our perception. We live entirely within the first. When you look at a tree, you see shape, color, distance. You experience it in space. You see it persist through time. You assume it is caused by prior conditions. But according to Kant, space, time, and causality are not features you discovered inside the tree. They are structures your mind brings to experience. Space is the lens through which objects become extended. Time is the form through which change becomes intelligible. Causality is the rule that connects events into sequence. Without these forms, experience would not be ordered. It would be chaos. This means something radical. The mind is not a passive receiver of reality. It is an active organizer. It does not simply mirror the world, it shapes how the world appears. You never step outside this structure. You never access the raw thing in itself. Everything you see, hear, touch, think, already comes filtered, already interpreted, already structured. And this does not mean the world is imaginary. It means it is mediated. We experience reality through the conditions that make experience possible, which leads to the limit. Human knowledge, Kant argues, stops at appearance. We can study phenomena endlessly. We can analyze laws of nature. We can calculate movement and predict outcomes. But the noumenon, the thing as it is in itself, remains inaccessible. Not because it does not exist, but because our cognitive structure prevents direct access. We are confined to representation. So the movement becomes clear. We trust what we see. Kant reveals that seeing is structured. Reality, as experienced, is filtered. And if everything we experience is shaped by the mind's architecture, if space, time, and causality belong to perception rather than to things in themselves, then what we call the world may already be interpretation. Which raises the next question. If this is only appearance, what is it that appears? Schopenhauer does not reject Kant. He radicalizes him. Kant had drawn a line. We experience phenomena, never the thing in itself. Schopenhauer takes that line and says, good, then let us fully understand what phenomenon actually means. He begins with a simple but destabilizing claim. The world is my representation. This is not psychological, it is structural. It does not mean the world is invented by imagination. It means the world, as experienced, exists only in relation to a perceiving subject. Everything you encounter, a city skyline, a storm, a human face, your own body, appears within consciousness, not floating independently in experience, but presented. Representation means something that stands before a subject. And this reveals something crucial. The world you know is always divided into two poles. The subject, the knower, the object, the known. You never experience one without the other. There is no object that appears without being perceived. There is no subject without something appearing to it. This dual structure is not optional. It is built into awareness itself. Every perception already contains this split, and because of this, the world you inhabit is always relational. Not just there, but there for you. This does not make it unreal. It makes it conditioned. Schopenhauer emphasizes that everything in the world, every object extended in space, every event unfolding in time, every cause leading to effect, is experienced under the forms Kant described. Space, time, and causality are not properties we discover independently. They are the way experience becomes intelligible, which means that everything that appears to us is filtered through these forms. The tree you see is spatial. The sound you hear unfolds in time. The collision you observe follows causality. But these are not accessed beyond the structure of perception. They are how representation works. So the world, as we know it, is not the world in itself. It is the world as structured appearance. Schopenhauer is careful here. He is not saying the world is illusion. He is saying the world is appearance, and appearance implies something that appears. Representation implies something represented. Surface implies depth. So the movement becomes sharper. The world is structured by perception. Every experience contains subject and object. Everything we know exists as representation, which makes the next question unavoidable. If all that we experience is presentation to a subject, if the world is appearance shaped by cognitive structure, then what is appearing? What is the thing that stands behind representation? What is the reality that does not depend on the subject-object split? Kant stopped there and said, unknowable. Schopenhauer does not stop. He believes there is a way in, not through external observation, but through something far more intimate. Kant draws the boundary and stops. He argues that while the noumenon, the thing in itself, must exist, it cannot be known. Human knowledge is confined to phenomena, to the world as structured appearance. The thing behind appearances remains beyond reach. For Kant, this is a necessary humility. For Schopenhauer, it is unfinished work. He agrees that we cannot access the thing in itself through external observation. We cannot peel back space and time like curtains. We cannot step outside representation. But he refuses to accept that the noumenon is completely inaccessible. Instead, he asks a different question. What if there is one place where we encounter reality not merely as representation, but from within? That place is the body. The body is unlike any other object in the world. You could observe it externally like any other thing. You see your hands move. You see your reflection. Others perceive your body as an object among objects. In that sense, your body belongs to representation. It exists in space. It acts in time. It obeys causality. But there is another way you experience it. When you raise your arm, you do not first observe a mechanical sequence. You feel an intention, an impulse, a push from within. Before the motion is seen, it is experienced as striving. This inner experience is not structured like perception. It is not rational. It is not conceptual. It is dynamic. And Schopenhauer makes a bold leap. What if this inner experience, this constant striving, is not merely personal? What if it is the key to what lies behind all appearances? The tree growing, the animal hunting, the storm forming, the planets moving. Perhaps these are not expressions of rational design. Perhaps they are manifestations of the same force you feel when you desire, act, and strive. So the movement becomes clear. Kant stops at the limits of knowledge. Schopenhauer turns inward. The body becomes the clue. Behind representation lies force, not form. And this is the turning point. If the world is representation, if everything we see is structured appearance, and if inner striving reveals something more fundamental, then reality may not be rational structure at all. It may not be orderly reason. It may be something blind, something restless, something driving everything from beneath. And that prepares the ground for what Schopenhauer will name next, the will. Schopenhauer's most unsettling move is not his pessimism. It is what he places at the center of reality. After arguing that the world we experience is representation, structured appearance shaped by perception, he asks what stands behind it. If the world is presentation, what is being presented? If phenomena are surface, what is the depth? His answer is stark. Not God, not rational design, not moral order, not divine intelligence. He calls it the will, but this term must be stripped of its everyday meaning. The will is not the moment you decide between coffee or tea. It is not the conscious act of choosing a career. It is not intention in the psychological sense. It is something prior to all of that, something beneath thought, a blind, ceaseless striving, an urge without explanation, a force that pushes before it understands. When you feel hunger before you form the concept of food, that is will. When you recoil from pain before analyzing the danger, that is will. When you pursue something intensely and only afterward construct reasons to justify it, that is will. Thought arrives late. Desire arrives first. This is the reversal Schopenhauer introduces. Western philosophy, especially after Plato and Aristotle, elevated reason as the defining feature of humanity. We were described as rational animals, thinking beings. Schopenhauer dismantles that hierarchy. Reason, he argues, is not sovereign. It is instrumental. It serves. It calculates paths towards what the will already wants. It does not decide the destination. We like to imagine we think first and then desire. He claims the opposite. We desire first, and thinking is recruited afterward. That is why he insists the will is metaphysical, not merely psychological. It is not just a trait of human behavior. It is the thing in itself Kant declared unknowable. Where Kant drew a boundary and said, beyond representation lies something we cannot access, Schopenhauer responds, we do access it, internally. Not through sensory perception, not through abstract reasoning, but through the direct experience of striving. Your body is not only an object you observe. It is something you feel from within as impulse, as pressure, as movement toward. That inner force is not representation in the same way sight and sound are. It is immediate. And Schopenhauer makes the leap. What you experience internally as striving is what everything is beneath appearances. The plant growing towards light is not choosing, it is striving. The animal hunting is not contemplating metaphysics, it is striving. The human building, competing, loving, reproducing, all of it is expression of the same underlying force. Nature is not a rational system guided by purpose. It is movement, pressure, hunger. The core movement of the section becomes clear. From representation to inner striving, from rational explanation to irrational force. Reality is not structured by logic. Logic is surface. Beneath it lies impulse. Beneath explanation lies compulsion. This is the key shift. The universe is not fundamentally intelligent. It is driven. And once this is accepted, something else follows. If the will is the underlying force of reality, if blind striving is the thing behind appearances, then desire is not a flaw in human psychology. It is not an unfortunate habit. It is the structure of existence itself. Which means what you call wanting is not an occasional disturbance. It is the engine of life. And that prepares us for the next step. What does it mean to live inside endless striving? If the will is the hidden force beneath reality, then what does it feel like from the inside? Schopenhauer's answer is simple and brutal. It feels like desire. Not occasional desire, not rare ambition, but constant lack. To desire is to feel the absence of something. To want is to experience incompleteness. To strive is to move from deficiency toward imagined relief. This means desire is not neutral, it is tension. When you are hungry, there is discomfort. When you crave recognition, there is agitation. When you pursue success, there is restlessness. The will manifests in us as a steady pressure, a sense that something is missing. And we believe that satisfaction will resolve it. But Schopenhauer dismantles that hope. Satisfaction, he argues, is not fulfillment. It is silence, temporary quiet. The desire subsides for a moment, and we mistake that absence of tension for happiness. But it does not last, because the will does not stop. Once one desire is satisfied, another emerges. The cycle becomes visible. Wanting, achieving, boredom, then new wanting. When we lack, we suffer. When we obtain, we relax briefly. When we stabilize, boredom creeps in. Boredom is simply desire reawakening without a clear object. Life oscillates between pain and emptiness, between striving and stagnation. Contentment is not stable because the will is not stable. It is movement. And consciousness, Schopenhauer insists, is not the master of this movement. It is its instrument. We imagine that we decide what we want, but often we discover what we want only after the impulse has already formed. We rationalize, we justify, we strategize, but the engine is deeper, which is why this line becomes central. We are not thinking beings who desire. We are desiring beings who think. Thinking refines desire. It does not originate it. Reason helps the will navigate obstacles. It calculates more efficiently. It builds tools. It plans long-term. But it does not silence the hunger. In fact, it often intensifies it because intelligence multiplies possible objects of desire. The more we can imagine, the more we can want. The more we can compare, the more we can envy. So tension is not accidental. It is structural. Will manifests as desire. Desire creates tension. Tension sustains life. Remove desire, and life stops moving, which leads to the next expansion of the idea. If desire defines human experience, if constant striving is not a personal flaw but a metaphysical condition, then it cannot belong only to us. It must define nature itself. And that is where Schopenhauer widens the lens. Up to this point, the will has been felt internally, as desire, as tension, as restlessness. But Schopenhauer does not stop at psychology. If the will is the thing in itself, if it is the underlying reality behind representation, then it cannot belong only to human beings. It must express itself everywhere. And once you look at nature through this lens, a pattern emerges. Nature is not calm. It is not harmonious. It is not guided by moral intention. It is movement. Roots pushing through soil, animals hunting other animals, cells dividing relentlessly, storms forming and dissolving, species competing for territory. This is striving without awareness. The plant does not choose to grow. It grows because growth is the expression of will. The predator does not morally justify the hunt. It hunts because hunger drives it. The prey flees not because of philosophical reflection, but because survival is impulse. Everywhere you look, life presses forward, not toward peace, not toward fulfillment, but toward continuation. Struggle in ecosystems is not ethical. It is metaphysical. There is no villain in a forest fire, no moral failure in extinction, no cosmic apology for suffering. There is only force meeting force, will colliding with will. And this expands the insight beyond the individual. What you feel internally as desire is what the world is externally as process. Inner striving, universal striving, life as collective hunger. Schopenhauer's view grows colder here. The individual, he argues, is not central. The species is. Organisms are temporary expressions, vehicles through which the will maintains itself. This becomes most obvious in sexual desire. Of all drives, Schopenhauer sees this as the clearest revelation. Romantic love feels personal, intense, meaningful. But beneath the poetry lies biology, the drive to reproduce, the continuation of the species. Individuals believe they are pursuing happiness. The will is pursuing survival. Once reproduction occurs, the illusion fades. Desire subsides. The individual may feel disillusioned, but the species has advanced. This is the cold realization. You are not the purpose. You are the instrument. The individual exists to serve the continuation of the will, which means your struggles, ambitions, attachments are not centered on your fulfillment. They are expressions of a deeper force that uses you temporarily. And when seen from this perspective, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. The universe is not rational. It is not governed by moral balance. It does not move toward harmony. It is hungry. Hungry in plants, hungry in animals, hungry in human beings. A blind force expressing itself through endless forms. And if that is true, if reality itself is striving without final satisfaction, then happiness may not be built into the structure of existence at all. Schopenhauer's claim is not that life contains suffering. It is that suffering is built into the mechanism of life itself. The mechanism is desire. Desire begins with absence. Something is missing, and that missing thing becomes a focal point. It could be food, recognition, security, status, love, achievement. Whatever its object, desire generates tension. And tension is uncomfortable. It narrows attention. It disturbs rest. It creates urgency. We are rarely neutral while wanting. We are unsettled. This is why desire feels active. It pushes. It demands movement. We imagine that once the object is obtained, stability will follow. But what actually follows is relief. The tension quiets. The mind loosens its grip. The body relaxes. And we label this state happiness. But Schopenhauer insists this is a misinterpretation. Relief is not fulfillment. It is the temporary removal of discomfort. The positive feeling does not arise from the presence of something new. It arises from the absence of tension. And absence cannot sustain itself. Once the urgency fades, the mind does not rest permanently. It searches, because the will cannot remain inactive. When desire subsides, boredom begins. Boredom is not peace. It is emptiness pressing for direction. It is the will without a clear target. And that state becomes intolerable quickly. So new goals emerge, new comparisons form, new ambitions arise. The pattern becomes visible. Desire creates tension, satisfaction quiets it briefly. Boredom reactivates the need for movement. The cycle restarts. There is no stable plateau. There is no final arrival. Even major successes follow this structure. You work toward a promotion for years. You receive it. The excitement lasts days, perhaps weeks. Then the new role becomes normal. New pressures appear. New standards emerge. The baseline shifts upward. The cycle continues. This is what Schopenhauer calls the treadmill of striving. You are always moving, but not toward permanent contentment. Movement itself becomes the condition of life. And here lies the deeper realization. Happiness is not withheld because you are unlucky. It is not denied because you are incompetent. It is undermined by structure. If the will is endless striving, then lasting satisfaction would contradict its nature. Life continues by generating new lack, which means the calm you seek cannot be permanent within the system. This is why the modern promise, one more achievement and you'll be fulfilled, never works. Each achievement solves one tension and creates space for another. And if pleasure fades this reliably, if satisfaction dissolves into boredom this predictably, then perhaps pleasure is not what we thought. Perhaps it is not a positive gain. Perhaps it is only the brief silence between waves of wanting. Schopenhauer's next move is subtle and devastating. He reverses the way we normally evaluate happiness. We assume pleasure is something positive, something added, a gain, and we treat pain as the interruption. But he argues the opposite. Pain is positive. Pleasure is negative. Not morally negative, structurally negative. Pain announces itself. When you are hungry, you feel it. When you are anxious, it occupies your mind. When you are physically injured, it demands attention. Pain has presence. It pushes forward into consciousness. It asserts itself. It insists. Pleasure, by contrast, is rarely intense in the same way. It does not shout. It is often quiet. Why? Because pleasure is not a force in its own right. It is the removal of pain. When hunger ends, you feel relief. When anxiety subsides, you feel calm. When pressure lifts, you feel lighter. But what you are experiencing is subtraction. The discomfort disappears. The tension dissolves, and the mind interprets this absence as happiness. But absence cannot sustain itself. The moment relief becomes normal, it stops feeling like relief. It becomes background. Comfort is quiet. Pain is loud. And this asymmetry is crucial. We rarely notice health until illness interrupts it. We rarely appreciate calm until stress returns. We rarely feel contentment as vividly as we feel deprivation. This means suffering is structurally stronger than satisfaction. Pain demands attention. Pleasure relaxes it. And because pleasure depends on prior tension, it cannot exist independently. It requires something to subtract, which explains why lasting fulfillment is so elusive. If pleasure were a positive force, it could accumulate, it could build. But if pleasure is only the silence of pain, then it fades as soon as it stabilizes. The structure becomes clear. Pain asserts itself. Pleasure silences it temporarily. Silence fades into neutrality. Pain returns in new form. This is not cynicism, it is analysis. Schopenhauer is not saying joy is fake. He is saying joy is reactive. It depends on the prior presence of discomfort. And this introduces a deeper dimension. Pleasure is not a positive gain, it is a temporary subtraction, which means the system of life is not designed around happiness, it is designed around tension and relief. And if life is structured around tension and relief, if satisfaction only quiets suffering rather than transcending it, then even success, no matter how grand, cannot solve the deeper pattern. If desire creates tension, and pleasure only subtracts it temporarily, then success appears to be the logical escape. We assume that the reason we are restless is because we have not yet achieved enough. Not enough money, not enough recognition, not enough security, not enough influence. So we transform desire into ambition. Ambition is simply desire stretched across time and given structure. It feels more dignified, more meaningful. But structurally, it remains the same force. You move toward a goal, believing that a rival will stabilize you. Yet something subtle happens the moment you reach it. The achievement does not end striving. It becomes normal. What once felt distant becomes expected. What once felt extraordinary becomes baseline. The mind adapts quickly. The will recalibrates. The standard rises. You no longer compare yourself to who you were. You compare yourself to who you could be next. This is where comparison enters the structure. Even if you succeed by your own measures, you do not live in isolation. You exist among others. And the moment others appear, new tensions emerge. There is always someone ahead, someone wealthier, more talented, more admired, more secure. Comparison turns success into insufficiency. Envy is not simply jealousy. It is the will reacting to visible alternatives. It sees new possibilities and feels new lack. And intelligence deepens the trap. The more imaginative you are, the more futures you can envision, the more standards you invent, the more ideals you construct. Which means intelligence does not calm desire, it multiplies it. Modern life accelerates this dramatically. Technology expands exposure. Social systems broadcast achievement constantly. You no longer measure yourself against your immediate environment. You measure yourself against global excellence. The field of comparison becomes infinite, and infinite comparison guarantees renewed dissatisfaction. Progress, then, does not quiet striving. It multiplies its objects. Comfort increases. Convenience increases. Opportunity increases. But so do expectations. So do benchmarks. So does awareness of what you do not yet have. The pattern becomes unavoidable. Achievement, elevation of expectation, comparison, renewed dissatisfaction, return to striving. The treadmill does not stop. It speeds up. You move faster, but you do not move closer to lasting peace. This leads to the cold realization Schopenhauer forces us to confront. Even success does not solve suffering. It reorganizes it. It disguises it as ambition, as growth, as aspiration, but the structure underneath remains intact. Life oscillates between pain and boredom, between tension and temporary relief, between striving and emptiness. And if happiness remains unstable even at the highest levels of achievement, if no accomplishment secures permanent contentment, then perhaps the issue is not how much we attain. Perhaps the issue is how much importance we assign to the individual self striving in the first place. And that opens the next question. We live as if we are the center. Every perception radiates outward from our point of view. Every decision feels uniquely ours. Every memory carries our signature. Consciousness reinforces this constantly. It tells us this is my life, my story, my suffering, my ambition. From the inside, individuality feels absolute. But Schopenhauer asks us to step outside that feeling. If the will is the underlying force of reality, if it is the deep layer beneath all appearances, then the individual cannot be its origin. The individual must be its expression. What we call self is not the source of striving. It is one temporary form that striving takes. Your personality, your temperament, your desires, these are not metaphysical anchors. They are configurations, patterns shaped by body, circumstance, instinct, and impulse. They feel stable because we experience them from within, but they are not foundational. They are arrangements. Schopenhauer's shift here is subtle but profound. Instead of asking, "What is the purpose of my life?" he asks, "What is my life an expression of?" That reverses the hierarchy. You are not the cause. You are the surface. Imagine a wave rising from the ocean. It has contour and motion. It appears distinct. It might even collide with another wave and feel separate. But the water does not belong to the wave. The wave is a temporary pattern within something deeper. When the wave dissolves, the ocean remains. Schopenhauer sees individuality the same way. The will does not exist to serve you. You exist as one temporary shape. Consciousness exaggerates its own importance because it cannot see beyond itself. It mistakes perspective for centrality. You experience the world from your vantage point, so you assume your vantage point is privileged. But that privilege is experiential, not ontological. Feeling central does not mean being central. Nature does not reorganize itself around individual plans. It produces, sustains, and replaces individuals continuously. Billions before you, billions after you. The pattern persists, the forms change. This is the new idea introduced here. Individuality is a form the will passes through, not its purpose. You are not the final product. You are a temporary expression, a localized manifestation of a force that does not begin or end with you. The movement becomes clearer. From "I am the center" to "I am a manifestation" to "the force continues beyond me." And once this shift stabilizes, another implication follows. If individuality is temporary, if identity is a passing configuration rather than ultimate reality, then death may not be what we think it is. It may not be annihilation of reality, but dissolution of perspective. If individuality is only a temporary configuration of the will, then death must be seen differently. From inside a human life, death feels catastrophic. It appears as total erasure, the end of memory, the end of perception, the end of agency, the end of my world. Because our experience is always centered in perspective, The disappearance of that perspective feels like the disappearance of everything. But Schopenhauer separates two layers: the individual personality and the underlying force that animated it. What dies is the organized perspective. Your memories dissolve, your habits cease, your character vanishes, your specific narrative ends. The arrangement collapses, but the material that composed you does not vanish into nothingness. Your body returns to processes already underway. Elements re-enter the environment, energy redistributes, matter transforms, nature absorbs without interruption. Nothing in the larger system halts. More importantly, the will does not depend on any single individual expression. The striving that animated you is not extinguished by your disappearance. It continues in others, in newborns, in plants growing, in animals hunting, in the endless repetition of life. From the perspective of the will, there is no central tragedy in death. There is only transformation of form. This reframes fear. We do not fear the end of the force, we fear the end of ourselves as center. The ego resists dissolution. It cannot imagine existence without its own vantage point. But the will does not require that vantage point. It requires continuation. And continuation does not depend on you. This is where Schopenhauer becomes almost clinical. Nature does not privilege individuals. It produces them, uses them, replaces them. The forest does not collapse when one tree falls. The species does not end when one organism dies. The system moves forward without pause. The cold undercurrent is unavoidable. Nature does not mourn individuals. It replaces them. This does not mean human grief is false. It means grief belongs to perspective. From within the individual frame, loss feels immense. From the impersonal level of the will, nothing essential has changed. The pattern persists, forms rotate, and this introduces the new idea clearly. What ends is personality, not the underlying force. The core movement becomes stark. Individual life ends. Underlying force persists. Personal meaning collapses. If personal identity is temporary and replaceable, if existence continues effortlessly beyond each individual life, then the question becomes sharper. How does the will guarantee this continuation so efficiently? And that is where reproduction reveals itself, not as romance, but as mechanism. If individuals are temporary expressions of the will, then reproduction becomes the clearest demonstration of what truly matters. Schopenhauer views romantic love not as sacred destiny, but as strategy. From the inside, love feels overwhelming. It feels unique, personal, fated. You believe you have found the person. You experience intensity, obsession, devotion. It feels metaphysical. But from Schopenhauer's perspective, this intensity is not centered on your happiness. It is centered on continuation. The species prioritizes itself over the individual. Sexual attraction is not random chemistry. It is unconscious selection. Traits that complement, bodies that fit reproductive viability, signals interpreted without awareness. The individual experiences this as romance. The will experiences it as preservation. Romantic intensity masks biological function. The more irrational the attraction, the stronger the drive of destiny. Because the stronger the illusion of destiny, the more effectively the species secures reproduction. What feels like personal fulfillment often culminates in a child. And once reproduction occurs, the intensity frequently shifts. Desire cools, reality returns, illusion fades. The task has been completed. This does not make love fake, it makes it instrumental. Desire feels personal because consciousness localizes it, but its aim is impersonal. Parents sacrificing for offspring reveals this even more clearly. A mother or father will endure pain, exhaustion, even danger. Why? Because the will invests more heavily in continuation than in comfort. The individual body becomes secondary to the survival of the next generation. The pattern becomes undeniable. Personal passion, species continuation, individual expendability. The new idea introduced here is sharp. What feels like destiny may be genetic strategy. The emotions feel elevated, but their function is grounded. And the cold realization can now be stated cleanly. You are not central, you are functional. A temporary bearer of a force that aims not at your fulfillment, but its own continuation. After stripping away optimism, after dismantling illusions of personal centrality, Schopenhauer does something unexpected. He finds the beginning of morality not in virtue, but in pain. Compassion, for him, is not a noble trait cultivated by saints. It is a recognition, an immediate awareness of another being's suffering. You see someone injured. You witness fear. You observe grief, and something happens before reasoning begins. There is a tightening in you, a response that does not feel calculated. In that moment, the strict boundary between self and other weakens. You do not merely register information, you feel resonance. Their pain is not abstract, it touches you. Schopenhauer argues that this is the true origin of morality. Not commandments, not religious codes, not fear of punishment or hope of reward. Those systems may regulate behavior, but compassion precedes them. It does not ask, "Is this required?" It feels, "This is suffering." And in that recognition, something shifts. For a brief moment, the illusion of radical separation softens. The individual perspective expands. You see that suffering is not an exception in life. It is the condition. It is shared. This universality matters. If suffering were rare, morality might be optional. But if suffering is built into existence, then recognizing it becomes unavoidable. Compassion is not theological. It does not require belief in God. It does not depend on metaphysical optimism. It arises from perception. You see vulnerability. You recognize yourself in it. And from that recognition comes restraint, a refusal to deepen pain unnecessarily. The new idea introduced here is precise. Morality does not emerge from commandments. It emerges from perception. The movement becomes clear. Individual perspective, recognition of shared vulnerability, compassion as spontaneous response. This is ethics without grand narrative. No promise of cosmic justice, no assurance of reward. Just awareness. And if morality arises from recognizing suffering, if compassion is grounded in direct perception rather than divine order, then it does not require God or abstract virtue to exist. It only requires seeing clearly. If compassion arises from recognition of shared suffering, then morality does not need to be commanded. Schopenhauer breaks sharply from traditions that ground ethics in divine authority. He does not deny that religions produce moral systems. He questions their foundation. If you act kindly because you fear punishment or because you expect reward, is that compassion or calculation? For Schopenhauer, genuine morality cannot depend on external incentives. It cannot rely on heaven, hell, karma, or cosmic balancing, because those frameworks turn ethics into strategy. They transform goodness into transaction. Real compassion, he argues, is pre-rational. It happens before ideology, before theology, before moral theory. You see suffering and you respond, not because a rule commands it, not because a doctrine instructs it, but because you identify. This is the crucial distinction. Compassion is not obedience, it is identification. In obedience, the self remains separate. I will follow this rule. In identification, separation weakens. Their pain is not entirely foreign to me. This difference is enormous. Rule following can produce moral behavior, but empathy produces moral motivation. You can obey a law while feeling indifferent. You cannot truly feel compassion while remaining detached. Schopenhauer's ethics, then, is grounded in experience. It does not depend on metaphysical optimism. There is no guarantee that good actions will be rewarded, no assurance that justice ultimately prevails. The world may remain indifferent, suffering may continue, cruelty may persist, yet compassion remains possible. That is the tonal shift here. No divine guarantee, no cosmic justice, no moral optimism, and still ethics survives, because it is rooted not in hope, but in perception. This reframes morality entirely. It does not need to promise a better world, it only needs to reduce unnecessary harm. And if compassion softens the will's cruelty, if it interrupts blind striving even briefly, then cruelty must do the opposite. It must intensify the very force that produces suffering. And that tension defines the final section of this part. If the will is blind striving, always pushing, always asserting, then cruelty is not an anomaly. It is escalation. Cruelty intensifies the logic of the will. It says, my impulse over yours, my survival over yours, my desire at your expense. Domination is the will amplifying itself. When one being imposes suffering on another for gain, pleasure, or indifference, the cycle tightens. Pain multiplies. Resentment grows. Struggle deepens. Cruelty does not merely cause harm, it reinforces the underlying structure of blind striving. It strengthens separation. It hardens ego. Compassion does something radically different. It interrupts. Not permanently, but meaningfully. When you recognize another's suffering as real and not separate from your own vulnerability, something shifts. The impulse to dominate weakens. The instinct to assert gives way to restraint. This is not weakness, it is suspension, a pause in the machinery. For a brief moment, ego-centered impulse loosens. The sharp boundary between self and other softens, and in that softening, harm becomes harder to justify. This is why compassion resists the will, not by defeating it, but by redirecting it, by refusing to escalate it, by choosing not to add to the total of suffering. The ethical value here is restraint, not heroism, not grand sacrifice, not utopian transformation. Simply refusal. Refusal to intensify pain unnecessarily. The movement becomes clear. Ego-driven impulse, recognition of shared suffering, refusal to harm. And this restates the shift cleanly. Ethics emerges from suffering, not virtue. We do not become moral because we are perfect. We become moral because we recognize pain. Compassion does not solve the structure of reality. The will continues. Striving persists. Death remains. But compassion softens the impact. It does not rewrite the system, it reduces its cruelty. And in a world driven by blind force, that interruption, however brief, is the only moral crack available. In ordinary life, perception is never neutral. You do not simply see, you evaluate. You measure usefulness. You scan for advantage. A chair is something to sit on. A person is someone who can help or hinder you. A landscape is a place to travel through or profit from. Your perception is guided by need. Desire normally drives attention. It selects what matters based on what serves you. This is practical perception. It is tied to survival, ambition, comparison, planning. It is perception in the service of the will. But something different happens in aesthetic contemplation. When you stand before a painting and truly look, when you listen to music without multitasking, when you become absorbed in a poem, a sculpture, a landscape, the usual orientation shifts. You are no longer asking, how can I use this? What does this get me? How does this benefit me? You are not strategizing. You are not striving. You are not calculating outcome. You are attending. Seeing an object without wanting to use it is rare, yet that is precisely what art makes possible. For a moment, your attention is freed from personal goals. You are not projecting yourself into the future. You are not replaying the past. You are not negotiating with reality. You are simply present. Schopenhauer describes this as becoming a pure subject of knowing. In that state, the individual ego, with its constant hunger, recedes. The cycle of striving loosens its grip. Desire normally creates tension. Tension demands resolution. Resolution creates temporary relief. Then the cycle restarts. But during aesthetic contemplation, the tension pauses, not because it is fulfilled, not because the will has succeeded, but because it has quieted. Art removes personal interest, and without personal interest, the will loses its immediate hold. This is the core movement. Desire normally drives perception. Art removes personal interest. The will temporarily quiets. And this introduces something radical. In aesthetic experience, you are no longer a wanting being. You become a perceiving consciousness without demand. You are not trying to possess the object. You are not trying to become something through it. You are not inserting yourself into it. You are observing without hunger. This is why aesthetic experience feels peaceful. But it is crucial to understand. This is not pleasure in the usual sense. It is not excitement, not stimulation, not gratification. It is relief from wanting. Pleasure satisfies desire briefly. Aesthetic contemplation suspends desire entirely for a moment. That distinction matters because pleasure belongs to the cycle of the will. Art steps outside it, temporarily. And if art can suspend the will, if it can quiet the machinery of striving, then perhaps some forms of art do more than suspend. Perhaps some reveal the structure of that machinery itself. Which brings us to the art Schopenhauer considered most profound: music. If art suspends desire, music does something even stranger. It does not merely quiet the will, it reveals it. Most forms of art represent the world. A painting shows a landscape, a face, a moment in time. A sculpture captures a body. A novel tells the story of characters moving through events. These arts present appearances. They give us images of the world as representation. Even when they are abstract, they still refer, indirectly, to forms, objects, situations. They show something. Music does not. A melody does not depict a tree. A chord does not resemble a person. A rhythm does not represent an object. Music has no visible referent. It does not imitate appearances. And yet, it moves us more directly than almost any other art form. Why? Because, for Schopenhauer, music does not copy the world of representation. It mirrors the structure beneath it. Painting shows forms. Literature shows characters. Music expresses movement beneath form. When a melody rises, strains, resolves, and rises again, we do not interpret it intellectually. We feel it. Tension builds, release follows. A theme develops, conflict appears, resolution arrives, or is delayed. This pattern mirrors the inner structure of striving itself. Music unfolds like desire. It moves like longing. It swells like ambition. It collapses like exhaustion. But it does this without concepts, without images, without language. It is emotional movement without idea. That is why music feels immediate. It does not pass through interpretation first. It bypasses the intellect. You do not have to understand music for it to affect you. You experience it directly. Schopenhauer's radical claim is this: music is not a representation of the world. It is a direct expression of the will. Not a picture of striving, but its sound. Not a symbol of tension, but tension structured in time. In music, we do not observe striving, we hear it. The rising scale is not about ambition, it feels like ambition. The unresolved chord is not about longing, it feels like longing. Music gives audible form to the metaphysical engine beneath reality. That is why it feels universal. A painting depends on culture, symbols, interpretation. Music can move someone across language, geography, history, because it speaks in the grammar of striving itself. It is the will translated into vibration. And yet, paradoxically, listening to music can still suspend personal desire. You are absorbed not in your own striving, but in its structure. You encounter the pattern without being consumed by it. This is the key shift. Art suspends the will. Music reveals its anatomy. And if music can express the deepest structure of reality, if it can give voice to the blind force beneath appearances, then what kind of human being can detach from ordinary striving long enough to create such work? What kind of consciousness can observe the machinery without being swallowed by it? That question leads us to the rare figure Schopenhauer calls the genius. Most of us enter aesthetic stillness briefly. A song absorbs us for a few minutes. A painting holds our attention. A landscape silences thought. Then the mind returns. Tasks resurface. Desires reactivate. The machinery restarts. For Schopenhauer, genius is not simply talent. It is the rare capacity to remain in that state longer. Where ordinary perception is driven by personal interest, genius perceives without asking, "What does this do for me?" The genius does not look at the world primarily as a resource. They see patterns, forms, structures, essences. While most people encounter reality through need, the genius encounters it through contemplation. This is not moral superiority, it is cognitive detachment, an ability to suspend ego-driven impulse long enough to observe the world as representation without immediately converting it into use. Genius sees universal forms instead of private concerns. Where one person sees my problem, the genius sees the structure of human experience itself. Where one person sees my desire, the genius sees the structure of striving itself. This extended stillness allows the artist to translate perception into form. Painting, music, literature. without being entirely swallowed by personal hunger. But this state is rare, and it is unstable, because the will does not disappear. The genius still lives inside the same metaphysical engine as everyone else. Hunger returns. Ambition returns. Personal suffering returns. The detachment is temporary. That is the cold clarification at the heart of this part. Art does not defeat the will. It pauses it. Even the greatest artistic insight does not end striving. It only suspends it. Ordinary life equals constant striving. Art equals temporary stillness. Genius equals extended stillness, but not permanent. This matters because it prevents romantic exaggeration. Schopenhauer is not claiming that art redeems existence. He is not claiming it transforms reality. He is claiming something smaller and perhaps more honest. Art does not solve suffering. It suspends it. For a moment, you step outside the machinery. You observe it. You breathe. But the machine remains intact. And that leads to the final question. If art only pauses the machinery, if even genius cannot permanently escape striving, is there a way to stop it entirely? That question prepares the ground for Schopenhauer's most radical proposal. Not suspension, but denial of the will itself. Up until now, every solution has been partial. You improve your circumstances, suffering remains. You succeed, desire expands. You find beauty, the machinery resumes. At some point, the realization becomes unavoidable. The problem is not your situation, it is structure. Suffering is not an accident of bad luck. It is not merely the result of injustice, poverty, or failure. It is built into striving itself. As long as desire continues, tension continues. As long as tension continues, dissatisfaction returns. And no amount of rearranging the external world alters that pattern. This is the turning point. Instead of trying to manage desire, instead of trying to satisfy it more efficiently, Schopenhauer asks a more radical question. What if the only real response is to weaken it? This marks a shift from participation to resistance. Most of life operates on participation. You want, you pursue, you compete, you reproduce, you strive. Even self-improvement remains inside the structure. It attempts to optimize the will. Asceticism does something different. It refuses to optimize. It refuses to escalate. It recognizes blind impulse and chooses not to obey it. That distinction is crucial. Frustration is not asceticism. Frustration is blocked desire. It still wants. It just cannot obtain. Ascetic withdrawal is deliberate. It sees desire clearly and loosens its grip intentionally. This is the core movement, recognizing suffering, understanding its source in desire, choosing to weaken desire. And here a new definition of freedom appears. Freedom is not maximizing desire. It is reducing its hold over you. Modern culture often defines freedom as expansion, more options, more consumption, more self-expression, more fulfillment. Schopenhauer reverses this. True freedom is subtraction. It is quieting the compulsion to chase. It is diminishing the force that keeps the cycle spinning. And this must be clarified carefully. Asceticism is not hatred of life. It is not resentment toward existence. It is not dramatic self-punishment. It is refusal to fuel the mechanism. You do not rage against the will. You starve it, gently, gradually, by declining to intensify desire. This shift redefines compassion as well. If suffering is rooted in striving, if reproduction perpetuates striving, if ambition multiplies competition, then the deepest compassion may not be expansion. It may be restraint. And that leads forward naturally. If desire sustains suffering, then what would it mean to withdraw not only from ambition, but from reproduction itself? That question moves us toward the figure who embodies this refusal most completely: the saint. If the will is blind striving, and if suffering is its inevitable shadow, then the most radical response is not reform, it is retreat. Schopenhauer's saint is not a miracle worker, not a political leader, not a reformer reshaping society. The saint is someone who has understood the structure and chosen not to participate in it. This figure minimizes personal striving. Ambition fades, competition loses appeal, status becomes irrelevant. The saint does not chase recognition, wealth, or influence, not because these things are evil, but because they feed the mechanism. Voluntary poverty is not romanticized hardship. It is reduction of entanglement. Fewer desires, fewer attachments, fewer hooks pulling consciousness outward. Celibacy becomes even more radical. If sexual desire is the will's strongest strategy, if reproduction is how striving perpetuates itself, then abstaining is a refusal to extend the cycle. This is not hostility toward life, it is refusal to multiply suffering. Silence replaces assertion. Where most of life pushes outward, speaking, competing, persuading, the saint withdraws. Nonviolence becomes more than moral virtue. It becomes metaphysical restraint. To harm another intensifies the will. To dominate reinforces separation. To compete deepens struggle. The saint refuses escalation. Compassion deepens into something quieter, not dramatic sacrifice, not heroic virtue, but reduction of ego. Compassion at this stage becomes almost self-erasure, not in despair, but in detachment. The core movement becomes clear: compassion, reduction of ego, renunciation of personal ambition. This is where Schopenhauer converges with Eastern traditions. In Buddhism, suffering arises from craving, and liberation comes through its cessation. In certain strands of Hindu philosophy, detachment from desire leads toward liberation from the cycle of rebirth. Schopenhauer saw in these traditions something Western philosophy had rarely articulated: freedom through reduction, liberation through disengagement. Not conquering the world, not mastering it, not reforming it, stepping back from it. This introduces a crucial clarification. Holiness for Schopenhauer is not moral heroism, it is metaphysical disengagement. The saint does not defeat the will in battle, he declines to serve it. The tone shifts here. There is no triumph, no victory speech, no grand redemption. The saint does not conquer the world, he steps out of it, quietly. But if reproduction is the will's strongest engine, if life continues through the intensity of desire, then the most radical refusal may not simply be minimizing ambition, it may be declining to continue the cycle at all. And that leads to the darkest implication of Schopenhauer's thought. If desire sustains suffering, and reproduction sustains desire, then the argument reaches its most uncomfortable clarity. For Schopenhauer, reproduction is not merely biological, it is metaphysical. It is the will securing its continuation. Sexual desire feels intimate. It feels romantic, personal, destined. It feels like your story. But beneath the poetry lies pressure, a force older than your personality, a drive that ensures the species persists, regardless of whether individual lives are peaceful or tormented. The will does not ask whether life is happy. It asks only whether it continues. And it continues through attraction, through longing, through the illusion that fulfillment lies in union. That is why romantic love in Schopenhauer's view feels overwhelming. It must. The species depends on it. But if every birth introduces a new consciousness into a structure of striving, into tension, dissatisfaction, loss, comparison, decay, then reproduction is not neutral. It extends the cycle. This is where antinatalism emerges, not as emotional despair, but as logical consequence. If suffering is built into existence, then choosing not to create new existence prevents new suffering. Non-existence contains no pain, no ambition, no envy, no regret, no death anxiety. It contains nothing, and therefore nothing to harm. Recognition of suffering, withdrawal from desire, refusal to perpetuate the cycle. That is the movement taken to its edge. And here, the dark conclusion becomes unmistakable. The only way to escape suffering is to stop wanting. But even here, Schopenhauer is subtle. He does not glorify suicide. He explicitly rejects it as ultimate solution. Suicide, he argues, is still an act of the will. It is desire attempting to escape pain. It is dissatisfaction turned inward. It is still striving, only in reverse. Denial of the will is different. It is not an explosion. It is a fading. It is gradual quieting, less craving, less assertion, less attachment, less continuation. It is the slow reduction of hunger. And this reduction is not triumphant. There is no victory banner, no philosophical fireworks, no redemption speech, just silence, a lessening of motion, a thinning of impulse, a world not conquered but gently stepped away from. This is why the ending feels cold. There is no promise of paradise, no metaphysical reward, only stillness. Not dramatic, not heroic, not triumphant, just the diminishing of striving. And in that diminishing, Schopenhauer locates the only form of peace that does not contradict his own philosophy. After everything we've explored, the will, striving, suffering, illusion, renunciation, the question stops being historical. It becomes uncomfortable. Was Schopenhauer describing the 19th century, or was he describing us? Look at consumer culture, an entire economic system built on dissatisfaction. Advertising does not sell products, it sells lack. You are not complete, yet. You are not attractive, yet. You are not successful, yet. The solution is always one purchase away, but the purchase never ends the wanting. It updates it. The object changes, the structure remains. Desire to acquisition, to adaptation, to new desire. The treadmill's scaled globally. What Schopenhauer described as metaphysical striving now appears as economic engine. And then there is social media. Comparison, once limited to neighbors, now extends to millions. You do not merely desire, you measure. Every image becomes a reference point. Every success becomes a reminder. The will expands through visibility. Envy becomes ambient. Restlessness becomes normalized. You scroll not because you are fulfilled, but because you are searching for something undefined, searching for confirmation, searching for a moment that stills the internal tension. It rarely comes. Romantic obsession intensifies too. Dating apps promise infinite choice, but infinite choice does not quiet longing, it multiplies it. The fantasy of perfect compatibility fuels constant evaluation. Attachment feels urgent. Breakup feels catastrophic. The will disguises biological continuation as destiny. Schopenhauer saw this before algorithms amplified it. And then there is success. More people than ever achieve career milestones, public recognition, financial stability, yet burnout spreads. Why? Because achievement removes one desire and exposes the next. You reach a goal, the horizon shifts, satisfaction flickers, then restlessness returns. Even success does not silence striving, it refines it. Burnout, then, may not be weakness, it may be structural exhaustion. The nervous system overwhelmed by constant pursuit, by optimization, by comparison, by expansion without stillness. We call it stress, we call it productivity culture, but underneath it resembles what Schopenhauer described: endless tension without final arrival. The modern world did not eliminate the will, it industrialized it, scaled it, digitized it, optimized it. And yet, despite all this, moments of relief still appear. Art still suspends desire. Compassion still interrupts cruelty. Withdrawal still tempts the exhausted. Which makes the final question sharper. Was he right? Is life structurally restless? Is happiness unstable by design? Are we desiring beings who think, not thinking beings who desire? Optimists argue progress improves the human condition, and it does, materially. But has it quieted striving or made it more efficient? Schopenhauer does not leave us with comfort, he leaves us with diagnosis. And whether you accept his solution or reject it, the pattern he described remains disturbingly familiar. The world has changed, technology has advanced, opportunities have multiplied, but the hunger feels the same. So perhaps the most unsettling possibility is this: he was not merely pessimistic, he may have been precise. And if he was, then the real question is not whether we agree, it is whether we are willing to see it. And that's it for today, my friend. You were listening to Wise Alchemy. The conversation ends here, but the thinking doesn't. You and I will meet again. Thank you.